great pleasure tonight to introduce one of our own. Gail Johnson has been a past board member, and she has agreed to stay on as a staff member. She was our Native American expert. It gives me great pleasure to announce evening with Gail Johnson.
It is a pleasure to see each and every one of you here tonight. Thank you for coming. You really mean that when you say that. You probably won't introduce this. Maybe we'll maybe I'll ask them. Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? No. We can hear you. Our expert here in the audio is going to help us out. Is that? How about this? Is that better? No. Well, folks, our talk is over now. I hope now, folks, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure, and I mean that sincerely, to welcome you here tonight. Can everybody hear me okay now? Yes. Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to be talking tonight about treaties. Treaties between the American Indian and the federal government, and prior to that, between the Native American and Great Britain and France. There were over 500 treaties that were made in the course of 400 years between us, if you want to say the United States, before it was the United States. The first treaty following the Constitution, 1785, was the treaty that I'm going to speak about tonight, the Hopewell Treaty. The Hopewell Treaty was actually the Hopewell Plantation was the location that this treaty would be presented. And this treaty in 1785, there were 4 federal government, first government treaty after becoming the United States. There were 4 of the federal commissioners. There were 918 Cherokee. And they actually met at Hopewell Plantation, but beneath an old oak tree. The oak tree is no longer there. But if you care to look at this later on, you'll see some pictures of the house. The house was built in 1785. It was built for Andrew Pickens, and Andrew Pickens was a great hero in the American Revolution. Of course, he was at Calkins and multitude of other battlefields. So, very important. Now, the house is still standing. The house was built in 1785 as a small backwoods cabin. Now, after General Pickens took it over, he can increase the size of the house. So if you can see the pictures, the house now belongs and has since 1930s. The house now belongs to the university. The university is now restoring this home. They've just gotten through doing the porch. There's no furniture inside yet, but all of that is coming up hopefully in the near future. There is a map I have included here that shows you how to get to this marker. This marker talks about the Treaty of, and you'll see the map. The house is located on what was, at that time, the Kiowee River. It's now called the Seneca River, but it's the Kiowee River. And it's a beautiful location. It's located on a bluff above the river. Beautiful view of the river. And now then, not the river, the lake. But it's right at the entrance as you go over into Georgia. So in case you're looking for it, you'll see markers there at the lake, and then you'll have to go in a little bit farther. They'll show you just exactly how to get there. But it might be something you might enjoy doing. There is an old cemetery there. There's a number of things that they hope to eventually restore. But anyway, it was for 20 years the home of General Pickens. Well, Andrew Pickens he had started out actually as an Indian fighter against the Cherokee. He was responsible for the deaths of many Cherokee. This was a very volatile period of time, the 1760s, from the time of the proclamation of 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War. It had been hoped by Great Britain that they could eliminate the dreadful problem that was happening. Every time a boundary line was formed between the English, or the settlers will say, because others came as well, between the settlers and the Native Americans, the settlers kind of went over the line, usually. It was more often that they would do that. Occasionally the Native Americans did too. But usually, this was a period before the word was invented. It was a period of westward expansion, manifest destiny, if you will. That term did not come into being until the 1800s, but manifest destiny actually described it pretty well as it was formed. These folks that were headed west had no concept of how the Native Americans felt, neither did they have any concept of what the settlers felt. There was a total division in the understanding of these people. The Native Americans had no concept of buying land. You couldn't own your mother. And the land was considered by the Native American as mother. You could not buy land. Land was shared equally between all members of the tribe. The hunting grounds, the land that was farmed, whatever the case might be. But all settlers coming from Europe wanted to own their own home. They wanted to own their own land. But they seemed to forget that the Native Americans had been living on that land for thousands of years. So it was a time of so much suffering took place. So many people died on both sides during this dreadful period. So treaties were used in an attempt to make it easier to separate these two people. Well, the Cherokee themselves participated in 51 treaties in the course of their 400 years with the settlers. Actually, there were over 500 total treaties among the Native Americans around the United States, what became the United States, and the federal government. All were broken in one way or the other. So there was strife constantly. Well, they decided people really, the Native Americans really had a great deal of respect for Andrew Pickens. Scayagunsta was what they called him. And Scayagunsta means the border owl. And that's how he got his name. So it's a long story and how that happened, but we'll not bore you with that. But at any rate, they chose him, and that's why they chose his home to sign this first treaty as the United States of America. And this treaty was signed, hopefully to help the situation. It did help as far as bringing prisoners back. Part of the plan on this was to bring prisoners back who had been captured. There were many prisoners who would be captured by the Cherokee, particularly by the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. And these prisoners, if they were not killed, outright killed, they were adopted into the tribe. Many times, because the Native Americans were losing so many people, they had a different concept for family and for people. So they would adopt a person. If they had lost, say someone had lost a male member of their family, they would adopt a male member of their family. And many, many times, these folks that had been adopted into the family would not want to go back to the settlers and their original families. So it becomes a very technical, very trying thing, but this is one of the main points of this treaty, is to bring back those that have been captured. But not only those that have been captured, it was also they wanted their slaves to be returned, and anything like horses, cattle, whatever might have been stolen at that time. So there's a lot going on. It took a long time for them to make this agreement here at this home. But finally they signed the agreement and proceeded with it. Well, it lasted for a little while, but then it would go on to the next and the next and the next. Almost every one of the 51 treaties, like this one, gave away land. Andrew Jackson, of course, our president, Andrew Jackson was very much against the Native Americans staying in the South. He wanted to see them move to west of the Mississippi River. Well, they didn't want to move. The Native Americans had lived here for thousands of years. This was home. Their people were buried here. It's where they grew up. So they did not want to move. However, with his Act of 1830, the Removal Act of 1830 would eventually cause the Trail of Tears. So treaties, regardless of where it was and who it was with, treaties caused a lot of good things, but also many sad things as well, as the Trail of Tears and the loss of so many thousands of lives. But that's the treaty thing, and there were so many of the treaties, almost all treaties ceded land. It didn't matter how much it might be, 10,000, might be 20 million. Andrew Jackson had a battle in Alabama, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He defeated the Creek Indians there, with the help of the Cherokee, by the way. If it had not been for one of the warriors of the Cherokee, he would have been killed by one of the Creek Indians, who almost had him in his sights. But he was saved by the Cherokee. When he won this battle, he required from the Creek Indians 20 million, that's million acres. That was 1/5 of the state of Georgia and half of the state of Alabama. So every time, now this was a battle, of course, not all ceding of land was a battle. Many times it was a treaty. But that was the point, was not understanding how the Native American felt about the land and what had entered into this time, by this time, the early 1820s, a newspaper man by the name of O'Sullivan had come up with the term manifest destiny. And manifest destiny was considered by all Europeans to take over the continent of the United States, because they looked upon the Native American as subhuman. It was not thought that they could take care of themselves. So a lot of things worked into this plan too, but differences most definitely. So it was Andrew Jackson's idea that by the Removal Act, which was another treaty, of course, that he could move the Native Americans, 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. They could move these 5 civilized tribes to the other side of the Mississippi River. And at that point, it was going to be Oklahoma if they could get this done. So that treaty was passed, and that is what brought about the removal of the Indians of the Southeast. And of course, later on down the line, we get into the mid-1800s, we're now in the Plains area, and you're having the same thing happen there to move the Indians to reservations. And reservations by some people were thought to be not too bad an idea, because move them there, they would be supported, but they were a long way, usually in isolated areas where reservations are located usually, and so therefore they did not have access to jobs. It's that way today, to this very day, that jobs, the worst possible situation is to live on a reservation. The pay is really, really so much less than anywhere else in the States. But then the health situation is also another thing. So there are a lot of pros and cons for everything that has happened throughout this 400 years. But once again, always treaties were being made, treaties were being broken as well. It's hesitate to go too deeply into this in any way whatsoever, but I want you to feel like when this is over, that you feel like you want to ask any questions, please do so. I want you to feel that you can do that, please. But the Treaty of Hopewell was setting boundaries. The lines, yes, and the settlers were not to cross the line, neither were the Native Americans to cross the line in the opposite direction, so that they were hopeful that they could keep everyone separated and not have this problem. Well, as the years went on, things did get a little worse, and that's what brought about Andrew Jackson and the removal. It was legal to make a treaty with the Native Americans until 1871. In 1871, the federal government changed that. It was no longer legal to make a treaty with the Native Americans. But treaties that were made prior to that are still honored today in many cases. I'm going to say that, and I'm going to say one other thing really quickly. The Cherokee have filed tremendous lawsuit on the federal government. There are no records of what happened to the trust money that was given that the federal government carries. There's a lot of things going on. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that any deeper, but it's a very interesting situation. There have been other settlements made in the last 2 years that have settled claims that other nations, the Creek Nation and the Chickasaw Nation, have sued the federal government too. But let's go back to Andrew Jackson just a moment. When Andrew Jackson was trying to get his Removal Act of 1830 through, these 5 civilized tribes were called that for a very good reason. These people went through the law to try to stop Andrew Jackson from what he was doing. They went to the Supreme Court. John Marshall, Supreme Court judge, testified that and made his ruling that it was illegal for the state of Georgia. Well, it was a big thing with the state of Georgia. For the state of Georgia to attempt to move the Cherokee Indians out of their territory, that they were a sovereign nation, and therefore they would not be forced to move. Well, it got really bad. Georgia then found gold along the Georgia area, Georgia, and that just stirred things up that much more. So the first actual gold rush was prior, of course, to California. It was in Aurora, Georgia, and that's what brought the really strong fight to get rid of the Native Americans that lived there. And Georgia would not honor anything that John Marshall said. Neither would the president. Andrew Jackson said, well, John Marshall has made his decision, let him try to keep it. And he didn't do it. So there's just so many things that with all of the plans that treaties would actually help, they did not. And we go back, I'll mention one more time, 1763, the proclamation of the Treaty of Paris was the end of the French and Indian War. Now the 7 Years' War, some of you might know it, or the French and Indian War. We know the French and Indian War brought a lot of fighting, a lot of suffering, but it also brought in France into the picture, so there was always something stirring the pot. The treaties were hopefully to help. The King of England decided, okay, well, let's just draw us a line from one end all the way down, all 13 colonies were behind the line, and the proclamation of 1763 would eliminate the white people, the people who had come here as settlers. It would eliminate them crossing the line. Well, all colonies were covered in that, but that didn't solve the problem because constantly the settlers were increasing in numbers and they had to do something. Well, they started crossing the line, and the line ran all the way down through blocking off mountains of the Smoky Mountains, and it didn't work at all. But the intentions of the king had been good in their efforts to do this. Once again, another treaty. So, as I say, treaties were really important, and they started out so much of the time being meant to do good, not doing so. So a lot of suffering on both sides took place during that time. Now, I am going to be closing shortly. Folks, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. I want to try to answer these to you. You might find it a pleasant trip if you're ever out toward maybe going to crossing the lake into Georgia. You might want to stop by and see this home. This picture's of it up here. Seeing this home. And hopefully in the next couple of years they'll want to finish it and have furniture and everything in it. But it will be a nice, interesting place to visit at that time. Folks, anything about treaties that, please?
Yes, the Cherokee boundary line that runs through the upstate, is that a result of the treaty? And I've always wondered, how far does that line go to just to the
Okay,
south?
are you talking about the one between Spartanburg and Greenville?
Yep, and it goes down through Fountain Inn, and it's called the Cherokee boundary.
Right, but that one was prior to this. That one was, yes, sir. That one was prior to this. Now, the one that runs, and you will see historic markers of this one that runs down through Spartanburg, and you'll see markers, historic markers for it. They look like these markers up here, right? But that one that you're speaking of was supposed to be good. Didn't last. It didn't last.
Just the markers.
I'm sorry?
Just the markers, right?
Just, that's all that lasted, exactly. Yes, sir.
That boundary line was established at the Treaty of Augusta in 1763. And at that time, Greenville, Pickens, and Oconee counties were designated as Indian Territory, Cherokee Territory.
Right.
And it's just a few miles from where we're sitting right now.
That's true. That's true, yes.
It's Line Street and Greer.
Well,
That's right.
exactly. An interesting factor is that line, which is the border between Greenville County and Spartanburg.
Right.
That line was drawn by the governor of North Carolina,
That's right.
Governor Tryon. He wanted to claim Spartanburg County and everything east of that line for North Carolina.
Well,
And for 6 or 7 years, that line was part of North Carolina, and the king and Parliament in England finally told Governor Tryon, no dice, no cigar, that's South Carolina. And if it wasn't for that, Fountain Inn would be in North Carolina.
well, let's look at the Wars of the War. Are you familiar with the Wars of the War?
Tell me about it.
Oh, the war is a fascinating thing. This happened in 1802. South Carolina, Georgia, everybody's fighting on what was called the Orphan Strip. It was called the Orphan Strip because nobody wanted it at first. And so they threw it back and forth. It was where outlaws hung out. All kind of bad stuff took place. So everybody's fighting over it. But all of a sudden, when gold comes into being, they begin to think, well, this is not a very wise idea to do away with this. So they start finding, I want it. Have you heard of Ellicott Rock?
Is that the point with Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina?
Yeah.
Where they all intersect?
Yes, sir, it surely
Yeah.
is. And that was the Orphan Strip. That was the fighting of the Walton War. My grandparents were in the middle of that fight, and it happened down on the river. But that's one of those things. See? So it's funny too. Now talking about that. Look at what happened when they moved the Indians west beyond the Mississippi River. They moved them into Oklahoma. Well, everybody thought Oklahoma was so dry there was nothing they could do with Oklahoma, so let the Indians have it, because then they would be out of hand, there wouldn't be any problem there. But what happens then, the Omaha Indians, who were on that same property of the Indian Territory, they found oil in the early 1900s and became multi-millionaires. See, so you never know what you might be turning down, do you? That's true. That's true. Anybody? Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for your attention. Thank you. Yes, sir. I love it.
I understand that during the time of the Hopewell Treaty was being made, there were like 20, 25 Cherokee chiefs in all the various areas that signed the treaty. There were like 2 creeks out of the entire Creek Nation, and the Creek Nation would not adhere to the treaty.
See, that's just like what happened at the Treaty of New Echota. Exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
That's true. That is true. And so what happened was it really get nasty because each village had its own headman. Okay, you can call him a chief if you want to, but they would know what they call a headman. And hey, that village might go for something because of his influence, but then the one 5 miles away wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So it just caused all kinds of trouble because, once again, the settlers did not realize what a loose organization the tribal nations were. You're exactly right. You're exactly right. When New Echota was signed, the Treaty of New Echota was dreadful. That's what brought about the Trail of Tears. And when it was signed, only less than 100 people signed it. There were 16,000 people of Cherokee. So you see what few people ended up getting all of them sent west. Exactly. Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate your questions, folks. Anybody else? Well, I guess that's about time. How about some refer? Yes, sir.
The Cherokee was driven to Oklahoma. How many are allowed to stay in the area that they're in today in North Carolina?
I'm sorry, sir.
When the Cherokee was driven from North Carolina in this area to
Right.
Oklahoma,
Yes, sir.
how many were left in the area that they are in today?
Oh, and the Paulo Reservation? That's where my people are from.
Yes.
My father's from the Paulo Reservation. They hid back in the mountains. And it took about 10 years, and then the state of North Carolina took them under their wing. And this is, it's not a reservation. I mean, it's a reservation, definitely. It's called the Paulo Reservation. It is a reservation, but it was instigated by the state of North Carolina. And that opened it up as a business. So they were able to operate in the beginning, in the 1800s.
I think he was asking how many, did you say, sir, how many?
About 2,000. About 2,000.
And they escaped that deportation because they were hiding in places.
Exactly. They were hiding in the mountains of the river of Oconaluftee. North of Oconaluftee is to this very day is a very wilderness-oriented place. It certainly is. So they were able to do that. It took about 10 years, and then the state of North Carolina, thankfully, or I might not be here today, but it's a very interesting situation. And that was home, had always been home for at least 2,000 years. They can be traced back to that time. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I hope I answered your question. It's hard for me to hear with the air conditioning up here, so if I didn't,
did.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, first you have refreshments up here, and we want to thank you one more time for coming in here. And don't forget, any questions, I'll do a little list and answer them for you. Please come back again next month. We look forward to having you every single month to our programs. Thanks a lot, folks.